Welcome to Book of Revelation, chapter 12. Today we are going to go through the woman, the child, and the dragon. And if you are an eschatologist, Revelation chapter 12 is probably one of your most favorite chapters. There's certainly a lot of doctrine created around Revelation chapter 12. So we will be discussing some of it. Okay, Revelation chapter 12, verse 1. And there appeared a great wonder in heaven, a great wonder in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon at her feet, and upon her head a crown of 12 stars. Now, interestingly, it does not say after these things, okay? So we've gone through Revelation chapter 1 through to chapter 11, and if this was chronologically a chronological event, then it would say then after these things, but it doesn't. It starts with and there appeared. It is concurrent. So the reason why it says that is because this is a repeat summary of what has and is occurring in the vision at this point. Now, this particular sign or great wonder in heaven, as it puts it, is actually a yearly constellation, or at least part of it is. This is the constellation of Virgo, and it occurs each year around the time of Yom Teruah, which we will speak about and have spoken about. This is part of what they call the Mazzaroth. People get very concerned when we mention signs and constellations, which is fair enough. The Mazzaroth is the Hebrew version of stargazing, but it is actually one of the earliest sources of the constellation names. It dates right back to the book of Job, and a lot of scholars believe that the book of Job was certainly one of the, if not the oldest book that we have. And in Job 38, verse 31 to 32, it says, "Canst thou bind the sweet influences of Pleiades, or loose the bands of Orion? Canst thou bring forth Mazzaroth in his season?" So yes, I did have to do the King James Version because they're the ones that bring forth the name Mazzaroth there. If you've ever heard a Jew say Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov means congratulations, but it is actually derived from the term Mazzaroth. It literally means good stars. If ever you have a chance, and we're not going to get into it tonight, but if you so choose to, you can look up Mazzaroth and type in the word gospel message in the Mazzaroth. And it is an amazing picture of the story of redemption, actually in the constellations there, all right? Now, this particular great wonder in heaven had a similar arrangement, actually was straight over Israel, on Yom Teruah on the 27th of September 2017. However, this basic arrangement has also happened before. It has happened in September 1827, September 1483, September 1293, and even as far back as September 1056. However, there were more than that. That's just in the last 1,000 years. Interestingly, after this particular sign, wonder in heaven on 27th of September 2017, a very short time later is when Trump declared Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. This actually completed an 800-year-old prediction by, his name was Rabbi Judah ben Samuel. Won't get into it in this particular session, okay? But you can look that up in your own free time. But there is an 800-year-old prediction. It's a 3-part prediction, and all 3 of them came true exactly when he said they would. Now, this constellation that occurred on the 27th of September, it was a very similar event to what this picture is in Revelation 12, because it's one of the times where Mercury, Mars, and Venus make up the 3 stars in the crown that would be necessary to complete it, because the crown above I'll show you in a minute, but the crown isn't actually complete. It only has 9 stars. And so generally short 3. However, on the 27th of September, in that crown was Mercury, Mars, and Venus. So it made a complete 12. And including the fact that Jupiter was actually was directly in the womb of this constellation, was in the womb of Virgo. So it was very interesting to look up and see this. Now, this wonder in heaven could actually also represent a physical woman. Most speculate that it's a picture of Mary. And it could be, honestly, and it probably is, but this is also a spiritual event. There was almost another complete version of this star event back on September 11, 3 BC. Okay, so yes, so a lot of scholars, and I do mean a lot of them, actually believe that the birth of Christ occurred at that particular time in 3 BC. Yeah, and when you read how it interrelates with Herod and even with the birth of John, it's very plausible that that's exactly when Yeshua, Jesus, was born. This is actually a picture of the two dates. In the one there on the left is the 11th of September, 3 BC. And you can see up the very top there, you've got Leo. That's the crown. In that particular time, though, there was only like 9 stars. Some say that there is certainly more stars in Leo than just 9 anyway. But you can see there the sun is behind Virgo and the moon is at her feet. And then fast forward, 2,000 years or so, we have the exact same constellation occur on the 23rd of September 2017. But this time, if you can see close enough there, you'll see that in the constellation of Leo, which has the 9 stars, it also has Mercury, Mars, and Venus completing the 12 stars as a crown. Again, the sun, she's clothed in sun with the moon at her feet. I've got a very small note at the bottom there. I've actually used stellarium for these particular constellations. You can use stellarium and go forwards and backwards like thousands of years. It's pretty great. Unfortunately, they count 0 as a year. So that is why on Stellarium it says -2 BC, but it's actually 3 BC. Moving on. Then Revelation 12 verse 2 says, then being with child, she cried out in labor and in pain to give birth. Now to give birth literally means it's a time of awakening. You'll notice that any mother who is in labor and in pain doesn't necessarily pop out a baby straight away. It can happen, of course. Which is what a lot of eschatology scholars have believed. They've always believed for a long time that if this constellation occurred, if this sign occurred, it would be very, very quick, chronologically quick, or the events would happen very quickly. But that's not necessarily what has to happen. So to give birth here could literally just mean that there's a time of awakening, because labor pains are not an instant event, very rarely anyway. And let's just say there has been a time of pregnancy and now a time of pain, but the birth has not yet happened. And it could be, or could begin, the 3 days of the 10 days of tribulation could actually have begun on that 23rd of September 2017. That is what some people believe, that we're in the first of the 10 days of tribulation. Or the tribulation issue could go for years. Like nobody really has an authority on it. But I can see their point and why they would come to that conclusion. So Revelation 12 verse 3 says, and another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great fiery red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. Now this is important because later on in Revelation, these make a lot more sense. So at this point of the labor and the tribulation, this point is actually happening before the arrival of the 8th king. Okay, we'll get to there in a minute, but before the 8th king arrives. But all of this is still part of the dragon's plan. In Revelation 17 verse 9, it says that the 7 heads are the 7 mountains on which the woman sits. It then goes on in Revelation 17 verse 12, that the 10 horns which you saw are the 10 kings. And in Revelation 17 verse 10, it talks about the 7 diadems. It says, these are also the 7 kings. But you'll notice there, it continues and says, but not the 8th king. Now this is really important because the 8th king is not mentioned until Revelation 12 verse 9. So currently this is just 7 heads, 10 horns, and 10 kings working and trying to stop the birth and certainly trying and bring about tribulation. So verse 4, it says, his tail drew 1/3 of the stars. The Greek word there is aster. We've spoken about that before, but we'll go into it again. His tail drew 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman, who was ready to give birth, to devour her child as soon as it was born. Now it says third of the stars. The Greek word there being aster. Someone pointed out earlier that aster, we get our word asteroid from it as well. Okay, but aster, or the base of aster, the root word is stronio, and it means strewn over the sky. Okay, so anything that is thrown over the expanse of the sky. It is plausibly 1/3 of the missiles. Why? Because mentioned in earlier sessions, it speaks of how 1/3 of the ship sunk. It talks about a star falling and 1/3 of the ships will sink. And we also I demonstrated a few weeks ago that during World War II, 1/3 of the ships sunk. Actually, it's very documented. And some people think, oh, that means that particular event in Revelation has occurred. Whereas I would prefer to say, I think that is an echo of prophecy, and it will happen again. But it's very interesting that whenever the term 1/3 occurs, it is so far been a war metaphor. So it is plausible that this third of the stars is literally 1/3 of the missiles that are waiting to be used. And then we read on, obviously, when we're talking about in Revelation 6, that the sixth seal does say that stars are falling from heaven. You've got the seventh seal, trumpet's about to begin. And it's at that point that the eighth king is about to arrive. And again, we'll read that in Revelation 12, verse 9. The third of the stars could also just simply be a meteor shower. And there's a lot of evidence to suggest that that's simply true. Okay. Now, the woman, realistically speaking, could also be multi-prophetic. It could be Eve, Mary, and Israel. For example, in all those cases, there was an attempt to devour her child at the beginning of creation and throughout history of mankind. Even right at the very beginning with Eve in Genesis 3:15, it says, and I will put enmity between thee and the woman and between thy seed. Okay, so there's always a plan to get rid of his seed. In the birth of Jesus Christ, there was a proclamation by Herod to go out and try and slay the king. Okay, there was that action and event there. And of course, in this case, what I believe in Revelation, it's where the birth of the children of promise. Certainly at any point, Satan has sought to slay the righteous offspring. In this case, though, it's possibly connected to Revelation 12, verse 11, where it says that a whole group of people did not love their lives till the death. In verse 5, it says, and she brought forth a man-child. Brought forth there is tikto. We'll talk about that in a minute. But she brought forth a man-child, that's important, who was to rule all nations. That's also important, with a rod of iron, and her child was caught up unto God and to his throne. Brought forth there, tikto, it actually is the Greek word that means to produce. It's produced. The base of it means fruit from the seed, okay? It's to produce. So this man-child was produced, and it's possibly produced through the pain, the refinement, and also the trial of temptation. Remember in Revelation, or earlier chapters, Revelation 8, we're talking about the hour of trial in context of the Revelation, what that means. Now, it does say man-child who will rule all nations. There's two reasons why man-child is mentioned. Firstly, Jesus is male and is the ruler. And a lot of preterists will say that's all it means. However, mankind can also represent all humanity, and a man signifies, often in scripture, it signifies rulership. And it really, in context, that's what it means here. A man-child who would rule all nations. And rulers will rule. Believers will rule. And we see that in Revelation 20, verse 4. It says, those to whom the authority to judge was committed, also, that's important, I'll go back to that in a minute. Also, those who had been beheaded, they came to life and reigned with Christ. That's important. A lot of people, when they read Revelation 20, verse 4, they say that those who were beheaded, they're the ones that came to life and reigned with Christ. If you read all of Revelation 20, verse 4 in proper context, and also especially in the Greek, it does look very clearly that those to whom the authority to judge was committed, as well as those who had been beheaded, that group, they all came to life and reigned with Christ, not just those who had been beheaded. Caught up to God. What does that mean? Firstly, Jesus was caught up to God. And preterists will point out that that's what this is exactly talking about. However, it's actually unlikely to be about the ascension of Jesus because there is no mention of his death. Why would this detailed vision of a child being born and then being caught up to God, why would it miss the essential part of Christianity, which is the cross? So this is more evidence that the book of Revelation is part of future tribulation events. And previous events, for example, like Jesus being born and being caught up to God, are prophetic echoes. It's happened before, it's probably happened previous to that, it'll happen again. In this context, though, believers are also caught up to God. But there's two times we see come up here being used. There's two times being caught up occurs. And once is in life, and we see that in Revelation 4, verse 1, where it says, and the first voice, which I heard was like a trumpet, speaking with me saying, come up here. Okay, there's a caught up to God. But realistically, it also happens in death. Revelation 11, verse 12, it says, and they heard a loud voice from heaven saying to them, come up here. That's the two witnesses. They die, and then they're caught up to God. So to suggest that in Revelation 12, the child being caught up to God is only a life rapture event isn't necessarily correct. It could be that the child is caught up to God through a massive death experience. And maybe it's through the 1/3 of the missiles, through the wars. Especially, it could especially be the fourth horseman. Remember, 1/4 of the world that the fourth horseman kills and wipes out, 1/4 of the world actually claims to be Christian. And this could be part of the death and Hades agreement of Isaiah 28, verse 18. This would also reduce any righteous persons, whether it be a rapture event or through death, this would definitely reduce the righteous persons to less than 10 per city. If you remember Abraham speaking to the angel, and there was an agreement that wrath would not come if there was so much as 10 righteous people in a city. So this massive slaying of people or being caught up to heaven at some other point, might be at the very beginning, but it would certainly reduce righteous people to less than 10. I strongly believe that this excludes Philadelphia. The Philadelphia facet of the body of Christ are kept out of this. Now, that could be a rapture event, like I just explained a minute ago, or it could be they're simply protected in the land of Goshen. And if you've been with me for the previous weeks, you'll know that that's where Israel was protected during the plagues. So if this is rapture terminology, it means that for the first part of tribulation, the first part of the 10 days of tribulation, pretty much everyone will endure part of it. Then there would be a massive war that starts, and then, or during the massive war, the rapture occurs. Verse 6, then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, that they should feed her there 1,260 days. Into the wilderness prepared by God. Very interesting here that God sees the wilderness as his place. Okay, we always see the wilderness as, a place to avoid. And God's like, no, that's my place. In Exodus 19, verse 4, we read, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. There is a large momentum of thought that believes Israel will flee to a place called Petra. Moses and the Israelites are believed to have passed through this area in Edom when they escaped from Egypt. Local tradition says that the springs at a place called Wadi Musa, which is called the Valley of Moses, that spring just outside Petra is where Moses strikes the rock and brings forth the water. And you can read that in Numbers 20, verse 10 to 11. In Daniel 11:41, it does seem to indicate that Jordan, which is where Petra is generally located, the region of Petra, it does seem to indicate that Jordan will be one of the only places to elude the Antichrist's control. Again, Isaiah 63 verse 1 tells us that the Lord is coming from Bozrah, which is the region of Petra. Now, according to Jewish historian Josephus, a group of the Jews fled to Edom and Petra during the Babylonian invasion of the 6th century BC, when the first time Jerusalem and the temples were destroyed. Okay, the first time that Jerusalem and temple were destroyed, they all fled to Edom and to Petra. Petra's been around for a very long time. In fact, archaeological work shows it is super ancient and no one actually knows who built it. There's a little picture there. Feed and nourish it. It is in the wilderness experience that God reveals his name and his law. So the first time that Israel went into the wilderness, it says that he took them out there to make them hungry and to learn about him and who he is. So it is in the first wilderness experience that God reveals who he is, his name and his law. This second wilderness experience will include nourishing of their souls from truth. So they'll actually learn about the truth. And remember, Elijah was protected and nourished for 3.5 years, according to some tradition. And you can read that in Luke 4, verse 25. It actually says that through the drought, Elijah was protected. Now, it is expected or theorized that this spring at Wadi Musa will supply water for the fleeing Israelites for a second time during this event where they have to escape the beast. And it does say in Hosea 2:14 and in verse 16, therefore I am now going to allure her. I will lead her, speaking of Israel, into the wilderness. And in that day, declares the Lord, you will call me my husband, because it is in the wilderness experience that they will learn who he is. Again, concerning the 1,260 days, it does say the beast has authority over the entire world for that 1,260 days. You've got the 2 witnesses and the 144,000 who are sealed, who are ministering. Okay, some suggest that the 144,000 are actually there to protect and nourish Israel. Interesting. However, the slaying by the beast of whoever is left over of the saints after the first worldwide martyrdom continues. And we read that in Daniel 7, verse 25, where it says, they, that's the saints, shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. Verse 7 to 9. It says, and a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his archangels, and a war broke out in heaven. Michael and his archangels fought with the dragon, and the dragon and his angels fought, but they did not prevail, nor was a place found for them in heaven. Greek word there is Uranus. So no place was found for them in heaven any longer. So the great dragon was cast out. That's a really important word. We're going to talk about that in a minute. He was cast out. That the serpent of old, called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole world, he was cast to. Greek word is eis. So even when it says cast out, same Greek word, eis. And then it says he was cast out, and then he was cast to, same Greek word. So he was cast out to the earth, and his angels were cast out. Greek word eis, they were cast out with him. Okay, so in heaven, Uranus means the vaulted expanse of the sky, anything that's sprawled out over the sky, and cast eis, it means to the earth. Okay, in the Greek, it does mean the vaulted expanse of the sky. In Hebrew, the Hebrew word is shemayim. It is plural. Okay, shemayim means heavens, and it's possibly multi-dimensional, which leads to the next point. The serpent is cast out to the earth. It doesn't say cast down at this particular point. It says cast out to the earth. The usual translation for eis is into. So he is cast into the earth, as in he's now cast out from where he was deceptively hiding into this physical dimension. This could be from one dimension that he's been hiding in, and now he's out for the whole world to see. This. In verse 10 to 12, then I heard a loud voice saying in heaven, now salvation and strength and the kingdom of our God and the power of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brethren who accused them before our God day and night has been cast down. Different Greek word there. It's katabalo. Katabalo, whereas before, remember, it was, going back to it, it was just balo. Now it's katabalo. So they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives to the death. Therefore rejoice, O heaven, and you who dwell in them. So come on, heaven, it's time to rejoice. Woe, however, to the inhabitants of the earth and to the sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. Now, before our God and cast down, as I mentioned earlier, cast out, balo, but cast down here is katabalo. And it appears that God has put a stop to the accusations that Satan has been doing right there before our God, and he's now been disbarred and cast out, balo, he's been cast out from the courtroom. So he's been cast out from possibly wherever he's been hiding, that interdimensional, and now he's been out and he's no longer allowed to stand there before God and accuse the brethren. So it says here then, overcame him to the death. This was what I was speaking about before. It's probably at this point that we are very sure that there's less than 10 believers per city, and all the rest have been removed from the earth or have been hidden, like, for example, the woman, or they've been completely kept safe, like the Church of Philadelphia. Not the Church of Philadelphia, the facet of the Church of Philadelphia. Remember, the menorah is one body of Christ with 7 different facets. Revelation 12:13. Now, when the dragon saw that he had been cast to the earth, he persecuted the woman. Okay, so it's not just an instant event. There was a battle that goes on between Israel and the dragon. So he persecutes the woman initially, and is basically in Israel. Israel is initially attacked. There's probably a battle that goes on, but they flee quickly to the wilderness, which is what it says next. Revelation 12:14. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness to the place where she is to be nourished for a time and times and half a time. Now, 2 wings of the great eagle. Wings of eagles is mentioned twice in the Tanakh. That's the Hebrew Bible. Okay, in Exodus 19:4, it says, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. So it's happened there. I mentioned that before. Isaiah 40:31. But to those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. There you go, be nourished. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. Maybe it means here to escape. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint, possibly while escaping. You can see how they possibly connect here. And don't forget, this is going to happen through time and times and half a time. And I've spoken about this in earlier sessions, but in Daniel 12:7, during this times and half a time, the power of the holy people is completely shattered until all of these things is finished. That is equivalent, so that particular time is equivalent to 43 months plus Yom Teruah. So it's actually quite a full time, okay? Remember, it says, and from that time that the daily sacrifice is taken away and the abomination of desolation is set up, there shall be 1,290 days, okay? So during that time, the beast continues slaying the saints while this woman is nourished. And again, we see that in Daniel 7:25, where it says, the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. And again, in Luke 21:24, they will fall by the sword and will be taken as prisoners to all the nations. Jerusalem will be trampled on by the Gentiles until the time of the Gentiles are fulfilled. and I've gone through the preterism process before in earlier sessions. Revelation 12, 15 to 16. So the serpent spewed, look, there's that Greek word balo. We were talking about that before. It means cast out. So the serpent cast out his water. Balo, he spewed his water. It's more grammatically pleasant to read, I think. But he spewed out his water. It is autos haido. Autos does actually say his water. So he spewed out his water out of his mouth like a flood after the woman, that he might cause her to be carried away. The Greek word there, I'm going to give it a go, is potamorphoretus. That's a really interesting word. It happens once in the entire Bible, okay? But it means to be carried away by the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed, it does say swallowed, katapino, it swallowed up the flood which the dragon had spewed out of his mouth. Now, getting back to it, spewed, it is balo, to cast, to scatter. Autos, haido, does say his water, so this water belongs to him. It's something from him, out of him. Carried away, it, like I said, potamorphoteus, I think I pronounced that right the first time and not then, but it does mean someone when someone is completely overwhelmed, when they're drowning. So this is a massive spiritual and physical attack against Israel. But what about the earth opening its mouth and swallowing this flood? It does say the word katapino, which means swallowed, but the earth has done this before. It's the story, or rather the event, I like to call it, of Korach in Numbers 16, which is the rebellion against Moses, especially the rebellion against Moses as Messiah. Some context, Korach was very sure that he could do a better job than Moses. Just like this particular serpent believes that he can do a much better job than the real Messiah. And just in Numbers 16, 30 to 32, this is how it unfolded. It says, but if the Lord creates a new thing and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them up, speaking of Korach and his members and followers. So if the earth opens its mouth and swallows up Korach and his followers with all that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the pit, which is very interesting because we'll talk about that in later sessions. But if they go down alive in the pit, then you will understand that these men have rejected the Lord. And then the ground split apart under them, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them up with their households and all the men of Korach. So it has happened before, and it will happen again, because Korach was a foreshadow of the anti-Messiah, the Antichrist, who sought to take the position of the Messiah, Moses, little m, but certainly the Messiah at that particular time to Israel. So Korach, unfortunately back then, didn't actually escape the earth opening up. This particular moment, though, the serpent doesn't fall for the same mistake. Okay, yes, the flood gets swallowed up, but the serpent avoids it and moves his target now to actually attack the saints, which we see in the next verses, in 17 to 18. And the dragon was enraged with the woman, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring, loipos hosperma. That's what it says in Greek, who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus Christ. Okay, loipos hosperma, it literally means remnant of seed. This is the attempts, the attempts of wiping out Israel were unsuccessful. So these are the attempts to wipe out any other remnant or any other believer, which then is confirmed again in Daniel 7:25, where the saints shall be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time. That is how Revelation 12 finishes in most Bibles, but there are some translations that include verse 18. And it's verse 18 in some Bibles, and it's Revelation chapter 13, verse 1 in the majority of them, okay? So I'm going to continue Revelation 13, verse 1 as verse 18, because I think it flows really well together. So John has just seen the earth open up and swallow the flood. Now the dragon is enraged, absolutely furious with the woman, can't do anything about it. So goes and makes war with the rest of her offspring. And then Revelation 13 verse 1, or rather verse 18 in some translations, says, and normal English translation will say, you'll read it, it says, then I stood on the sand, but the Greek word there is kai. So it continues the story when it says, and when the Greek is translated as and, which is what it should be, it flows better. So if you read it, it says, and he went to make war with the rest of her offspring who keep the commandments of God and had the testimony of Jesus. And I stood on the sea, I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns were 10 crowns, and on his head a blasphemous name. Okay, so that's how Revelation 12 reads in a few translations. It includes that verse. This is why it's interesting, because earlier in Revelation 12, we saw that John had a vision of this beast rising up, and it had 7 heads, 10 horns, 10 crowns, and then remember 7 diadems. But this particular beast is now missing it. Why? Because it explains the Revelation 12 verse 9 outcome. What happens when Satan arrives? And we'll talk about that next week in chapter 13. But the world at this point is now fully deceived. The 7 diadems, which is the 7 kings, now belong to this 8th king. That's why there's no mention of the 7 diadems like there was in Revelation 12 verse 3, because the 8th king arrived in Revelation 12 verse 9. And when we get to Revelation 17, eventually you'll see that it says there in Revelation 17 verse 11, it says, they are also the 7 kings. Remember, Revelation 12 verse 3. But at that point, 5 have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. And then that's the 7. And then we have the 8th, which is at this particular time in the book of Revelation. Okay, so a bit of a recap, since Revelation 12 is a recap. And if you've been following the other weeks, this will start to certainly be very clear. But there are 10 days of tribulation. It's actually closer to 11 days, especially if you look at the plagues. There were 10 plagues plus a deliverance day. And we can see that in Revelation chapter 2. So whenever this begins, there's a beginning of birth pains for the whole world for 3 days of the 10 days of tribulation. Just like for 3 out of the 10 plagues, both Israel and Egypt endured them together. So for the first 3 plagues, everyone went through it. And it was only the last 7 plagues that Israel was protected in the land of Goshen. We can then know that a ruler enters the province by forceful deceit. That's in Daniel 11, 21 to 24. There is this agreement with this ruler, and the Bible calls it an agreement with death and Hades. And the Bible calls it that in Isaiah 28, verse 18. In Daniel 9, 27, that's when the agreement is made. And then, of course, in Revelation 6, verse 8, it talks about the horseman named Death and Hades, bringing massive destruction to the world. When that agreement is made, that will begin the hour of the trial of temptation, also called Jacob's trouble in Jeremiah 30, verse 7. So the hour of trial of temptation is different than the 10 days of tribulation. It is just one part of it. That hour of trial of temptation, or that agreement, I should say, includes building the temple. However, the Philadelphia facet of the body of Christ is kept from this hour, from this moment on. There will be wars, famine. You've got the first 3 horsemen that occur. You've got death and Hades, the 4th horseman, taking out 1/4 of the world's population. And as I mentioned earlier, it could just be a coincidence that right now, a quarter of the world's population actually claims to be Christian. You can look that up. Just Google. You can Google it. It's very simple. But again, I really genuinely believe that the Philadelphia facet of the body of Christ has been kept from this hour. At that point, there will be a pushback by the world. You can see that in Daniel 11:29 to 31. And Satan is also cast into our reality. Then there's a setup of the idol of abomination in the temple. The sacrifices cease. The sun and the moon are darkened. The stars fall. There appears to be a military attempt by Israel, possibly also by the southern, it's called the Southern King, which could be a group effort. But there's a military attempt by Israel, which is very quickly defeated, and Israel escapes into the wilderness. The earth then devours the army of the serpent that he sent after Israel. So because he's very mad about that, the serpent then goes after every other believer. And eventually, maybe at that point, or certainly not far from it, there will end up being less than 10 believers per city, as per the Abrahamic promise of what will happen before wrath. Okay? And we've already spoken about Daniel 7:25. And then, of course, at this particular time, during that times and half a time, you've got the two witnesses, you've got the 144,000 who are there to minister and protect. And at this point is also when the wrath of God begins, which are the 7 trumpets. And all of that occurs in the last 1,260 days. Then the very last trumpet of the 7 trumpets begins the final 30 days of 1,290 days, and it is the bowls of wrath. And the bowls of wrath actually occur in the very last month, the last 30 days, and those 30 days are 29 days and Yom Teruah for a total of 30 days. All right, next week, we will be discussing Revelation chapter 13. We'll talk about the beast, which is actually the 8th king at this point, and how this king is like a leopard. His feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. We'll also talk about the other beast, who is a false prophet. He had 2 horns like a lamb and spoke like a dragon. And of course, everyone's not favorite number, but the one that certainly gets spread around a lot is the number 666, which is the number of man.